Fiction is something that is formed in imagination. That is the indication, understood? And so fiction comes from the Latin word fictus, and fictus means to form. That is correct. Fiction is formed in the imagination. And when you open the text, the first part of your text, you have the text with you. Please open it. What is fiction? See, in this module, we have to explain, or I can only explain the terms and make you familiar with the terms. And when we go through the stories and novels and the film version, you will get the full meaning of fiction. For the time being, try to understand the terms. Hope you have understood the term fiction. The literature which is usually written in prose dealing with imaginary events and people, and the word is derived from the Latin fictus, meaning to form. It indicates that fiction is formed in the imagination. And then when you open the text, you will see the first sentence are very interesting. Yet most people know the difference between a lie and a fiction. A lie is meant to deceive. A fiction is meant to entertain. And so that is the simple definition given by Boulton in the Anatomy of the Novel. And Boulton is a very reliable critic, a very popular critic of the period. He says that a lie is meant to deceive others, but fiction is meant to entertain. And so it clearly explains the function of fiction. See, you read a novel, you read short stories, you go to the theatre, spend 3 long hours in the theatre. For what? For entertainment, pleasure. As Wordsworth says in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, every good literature has to fulfill this condition. That is, every good literature, be it prose or poetry or novel, it has a twofold duty. One is to entertain the reader, or again, it is meant to instruct the reader. And so even though fiction is based on imaginary events, on events which are not true, it conveys to you, the novelist, the short story writer is trying to convey to you a message or a meaning. And so every good literature is informative and it entertains the reader. And so this fiction also should give information to the reader, and moreover, from fiction you expect more entertainment. But some fiction, even though it deals with imaginary things, it conveys an important lesson. By presenting imaginary characters and imaginary events, the novelist conveys a message. And in such novels, the reader will be getting a message also. But the main thing is that the reader should be entertained. This includes, fiction includes a range of narratives, including, and then you understood what is fiction, what is the use of fiction, what is fiction you have understood, what is the purpose of fiction? To entertain the people. And then you will see what all are included in the term fiction. It includes narratives, including stories. Stories are there. Stories are fiction. Fables, fairy tales, myths, legends, epics, narrative poetry, plays, theatrical performances, films, TV programs, etc. And so all these are fiction. And so what all things? Stories, fiction, fables, fairy tales, myths, legends, epics, theatrical performances, TV programs, everywhere you will see fiction. Fiction refers to invented narratives in prose and encompasses three major genres in literature: the novel, short story, and novelle. And so mainly fiction. When somebody tells you about fiction, or when you hear the term fiction, actually it refers to the invented narratives in prose. What is fiction? Invented narratives in prose. And it includes three major genres in literature. And so when you hear the term fiction, what all things should come to your mind? Short story, then novel, then novelle. Novelle is a short novel that comes between a short story and a novel. Not as lengthy as the novel, not as short as the short story. And so, I told you that three things are included under the label fiction: novel, novelle, and short stories. And then we will see what is a novel first. What is a novel? It is a relatively long work of narrative fiction, normally written in prose form, and which is typically published as a book. And so, what is a novel? A relatively long work of narrative fiction. A long work. Novel is a long fiction. It's a long work of narrative fiction. And it is usually written in prose. And usually it will be in the form of a book. It is published in the form of a book. And so what is a novel? It's a long work of narrative fiction. And it is normally written in prose. And it is published as a book. A lengthy narrative is a novel. The present English word for a long work of prose fiction derives from the Italian novella, means a little new thing, which was a short tale in prose. Some novelists, I will give you some examples of people who described their novels as romances. They are Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and so on. They preferred the term romance to describe their novel. And so, novel is a long work of prose fiction, and it comes from the Italian word novella. It means a little new thing, which is a short tale in prose. And some writers prefer to call novels romances. And a novel is a fiction narrative that displays a realistic depiction of the state of a society, while the romance encompasses any fictitious narrative that emphasizes marvelous or uncommon incidents. And so, novels and romances are a slight difference. See, both as fiction. Novel is fiction, romance is fiction. Some writers prefer to call their novels romances. And so what is the slight difference? A novel is a fiction narrative that displays a realistic depiction of the state of a society, a realistic depiction you will see in a novel, while the romance encompasses any fictitious narrative that emphasizes marvelous or uncommon incidents. You will see marvelous incidents and uncommon incidents in romance. And again, Cervantes' Don Quixote is counted to be the first novel. Don Quixote recounts the adventures of a madly idealistic protagonist who lives under the delusion that he is a knight errant and consequently attempts to perform what he believes are chivalric deeds. And so don't worry about all these things. Just understand that when you study novel, the first novel is by Cervantes, Don Quixote. And the story, it is based on a fictitious character, Don Quixote. And so it adheres to the principles of a novel. In English literature, the novel form was introduced in the 18th century in such distinctive works as that of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, Samuel Richardson's Pamela, Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews, and Tom Jones. And so here, that is the first novel by Cervantes, that is Don Quixote. It adheres to the rules of the novel, and then it is said that in English literature, novels became common by the 18th century and more in the 19th century. The beginning stage you will see in the 18th century. In Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, then Moll Flanders, Pamela, Tom Jones, Joseph Andrews. See, in English literature, the primitive form, the beginning form of a novel can be seen in Joseph Andrews, Pamela, Robinson Crusoe, and so on. But a novel became popular as a literary form in the 19th century.